everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jillian and I am the creator and host of the true crime podcast called Court Junkie, where I cover criminal cases and trials. In my last video, I talked about how I filmed the television show 2020, and it was basically me just kind of making fun of myself. But in today's video, I want to get more serious and I want to talk about one of my recent episodes that I released on Court Junkie about the Jeff Deskovic case. I titled the episode, "Is This Really Happening? The Wrongful Conviction of Jeff Deskovic." And I titled it that way because those are the words that Jeff said after he was finally released after spending 16 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. So in today's video, I want to dive a little bit into the case and talk about just kind of how it came to be and why I decided to cover that case. So let's get started. First of all, I just want to talk really quickly about how I pick the cases that I pick. I get this question a lot, so I figured I would answer that here real quick. I basically am such a nerd that 9 times out of 10, the cases that you hear about in my episodes are cases that I just so happen to be following, kind of from start until finish. It really is a passion of mine and always has been, which is why I first created Court Junkie as a website and then turned it into a podcast. But so typically the topics just kind of come from my own interests, but I also do take listener suggestions, which I usually get through social media or through email, podcast@courtjunkie.com. And I then add them to like this little research list that I have. And then I look into each case from time to time, and sometimes I'll file a Freedom of Information Act request on them to see what kind of documents I can get, or I'll look to see if there is, trial footage that I can get from Law and Crime or things like that, or if there, is someone close to the case who might be willing to talk to me. So there's a lot of different factors that I look for when deciding whether or not I'm going to cover a case. In this particular case, Jeff ended up emailing me. He reached out to me and said, "Hey, I spent 16 years in prison. I have been exonerated, and I think my case would be a really good fit for your show. Would you be interested in interviewing me?" And I did my research on his case. He sent over everything from the prosecutor's report to YouTube videos and articles about him and just all these documents that he had about his case. So I did some research on it and decided, yes, I absolutely want to cover this case. And in fact, it would be my honor to tell your story on the podcast. So that's how that came to be. So before I get into some of the details about the case, I just want to let you know that I'm not really giving away any spoilers by some of the things that I'm about to talk about. If you have not yet heard the episode and you're planning on it, it's not going to ruin it for you because I'm not going to go super into the details. We're just going to talk about the basics here. And it's not giving anything away by telling you that he was wrongfully convicted and giving away the surprise, he was exonerated and he, in fact, did not commit this crime. In November 1989, one of Jeff's high school classmates, a girl named Angela Correa, went missing. And 2 days later, her body was found, and she had been raped and strangled and beaten. And it is just such a horrible, tragic thing that happened to her. 2 months later, Jeff was arrested for her murder. Now, I had asked Jeff if he knew Angela, and he said that, yeah, he knew her a little bit. They were classmates, so he knew her, from class and to say hi to her, but he didn't really know her that well. Now, there are a few reasons why Jeff was arrested, and I really go more in depth about this in the episode, but basically, one reason is that he was an outcast. This crime took place in Peekskill, New York, which is a suburb outside of Westchester. And the way Jeff describes it, he lived in an apartment complex. It was very middle class. And in his apartment complex, when he was younger, he was kind of the leader of the pack and he had friends. But when it was time to go to high school, he didn't really know that many kids and he was sort of an outcast. And this becomes one of the reasons why police started to look at him in the first place. Classmates of his, when being interviewed by police, apparently mentioned his name and said, hey, he's kind of an outcast, you might want to look at him, or whatever it was that they said. The second reason why Jeff was arrested was because he was exhibiting what police officers said was strange behavior. Now, they say that Jeff was acting irrationally upset about what had happened, about his classmate having gone missing and then being found deceased. Jeff says that everybody in the community was really distraught and upset about this, and that, yeah, he absolutely was upset about this. It did affect him to a level that he maybe wasn't expecting. But, this is someone who's of high school age who is found murdered and no one knows who the killer is or what happened to her. So he said that basically the entire community was pretty much obsessed with finding out what happened to her, including himself. Jeff also matched a profile put forth by the NYPD, and that profile estimated that the killer would be rather young, probably less than 19 years old, would be an outcast at school, may have problems with women, and may have problems with his mother. And at the time, that fit Jeff. And we would later find out that that profile was not accurate at all, but at the time, it definitely fit Jeff at the time. The other reason, and maybe the most important reason why Jeff was convicted, is because he confessed to the crime. Now, as someone who maybe doesn't, follow these types of cases very closely or very often, you may think that it would be really weird to confess to something that you did not do. But trust me, I've covered a lot of these cases, and I've even talked to different experts who, will explain that they definitely do happen. Sometimes people feel very overwhelmed no matter what their situation is. It's kind of like a perfect storm. And in Jeff's case, he was 16 years old when he was questioned by the police, and he didn't have his parents there. He didn't have an attorney present. And, he really sort of trusted this system, which I'll get into in just a second. So Jeff started meeting regularly with detectives after Angela had turned up dead. And they kind of won him over a little bit. They would play, good cop, bad cop, and do that whole routine, the kind that you see, in movies and read about in books, where one cop would pretend to be, his friend and to be looking out for him, while the other one would be, aggressive and mean and, kind of demanding that he confess and that sort of thing. So they did that tactic with him. And they also told him, hey, a lot of the kids at school aren't really talking to us. So maybe you could be sort of an amateur detective and you can go out and you can, try to get information for us and keep reporting back. And so Jeff did. Now, before I continue on, here's a little clip of how Jeff explains his initial interactions with police.
They would say things like, the kids won't talk freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear any rumors. Stop in from time to time. They would ask me opinion questions and congratulate me that my opinions were correct. They made me feel important. They made me feel I was in the center of attention. Before I was a teenager, I wanted to be a cop, so this early unexpected opportunity to do this quasi-police work was how, along with my age, being 16, they were able to rope me in. And secondly, just the fact that my father was never involved in my life. That was a factor that intersected with the good cop, bad cop technique, where one officer was pretending to be my friend, whereas the other one was aggressive. And I began to look up to the officer who was pretending to be my friend as a father figure.
Now, Jeff met with detectives several times over the next several weeks, and he was really playing that role of amateur detective. He said that he had even gone to the crime scene at one point. He would kind of listen in at school while people were talking about rumors of what had happened, and then he would report back to the police what was happening. On the day that Jeff actually confessed, they had talked him into going in for a polygraph test. So that's what he thought he was going in for. They had told him, look, if you just take this polygraph test, we can knock this, this suspicion off of you. We can stop talking to you like you're a suspect. And, you can kind of resume that role of amateur detective again. So he showed up. He didn't have his mom with him. He didn't have his brother with him. And he didn't even tell his family where he was going. And instead of giving him the polygraph at the police station, the place where he had been meeting with them for the last few weeks, they actually took him about 40 minutes away to another town and administered the test there.
And then they put me in a small room, and the polygraphist gave me countless cups of coffee in order to get me, it seems clear that he did that in order to get me nervous. And then he attached the machine to me, so now I really couldn't, I was fairly immobile. I mean, I could stand up, but that was pretty much it. And then he did his third-degree tactic. So he invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. As each hour passed, my fear increased in proportion to the time. At one point he said to me at the end, he said, what do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the polygraph test result that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it. And that really shot my fear through the roof. And at that point, the officer who had been pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and he told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he had been holding them off but could not do so any longer, that I had to help myself. Then he added if I did as they wanted, they'd stop what they're doing and I could go home afterwards and I was not going to be arrested. So being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long term, I was instead just concerned with my safety in the moment. Plus, I was in fear of my life. The fact that I didn't know where I was, that nobody else knew where I was, either it loomed very large in my mind, and then there was that push-pull dynamic of on one hand, the possibility of harm had been thrown in the air, and on the other, you had thrown me this false life preserver, so I took the out which they offered, and I made up a story based upon the information which they had given me in the course of the interrogation that day and in the 6 weeks run up to it, as well as items from the newspaper. By the time the interrogation was finished, I had collapsed on the floor into a fetal position and was crying uncontrollably.
So Jeff was told that he had failed the polygraph and, he might as well, just admit to it and that sort of thing. And, he was basically told, look, if you just tell us this, if you just admit it, you'll be able to go home. So Jeff thought after he confessed that he would in fact be going home. And he told me that he remembered actually feeling angry and betrayed by that good cop, the one that he thought, was his friend, because Jeff didn't have a father growing up. And, he was raised by just his mom and he just had his brother. And so this good cop over the weeks had become sort of like a father figure to him. So he felt really betrayed after, he was arrested because he just didn't understand what was going on and how they could trick him like that. Someone he had thought was like his father figure. Now, Jeff was shocked after he was arrested. There was something that he was not expecting at all. It kind of felt like it was all a dream to him. He spent 35 days in jail until a local business owner was able to bail him out. Now, there were definitely a number of factors prior to Jeff going into trial which should have sent up a lot of red flags to prosecutors that maybe they had the wrong guy. First of all, Jeff did have an alibi. He was playing wiffle ball with a friend of his, and the problem is that no one bothered to interview that friend, including his own attorney. There was also DNA at the scene that did not match to Jeff at all, and that included semen that was found inside the victim, as well as a hair that was found on the victim. And neither one of these matched Jeff. In fact, Jeff was excluded as a contributor. So it definitely pointed to somebody else. At trial, prosecutors kind of wrote this off to the jury, and they basically said that the DNA was probably from a consensual sexual encounter that Angela had had likely prior to her death, and that it probably wasn't important to the case. And they also said that the hair that was found on her likely was from the medical examiner or the medical examiner's assistant. Now, they never bothered to test the medical examiner or the medical examiner's assistant to back up that theory, nor did they test who they thought was Angela's boyfriend at the time to see if that DNA did match him. And Jeff's attorney didn't do any of these tests either. Now, despite the evidence pointing to somebody else, Jeff still went to trial. He was 17 years old by the time he entered the courtroom, and he had no knowledge whatsoever of the way the justice system worked and how everything was going to go. And so he relied on his attorney a lot. And I get into it more in the episode, or I should say Jeff gets into it more, but his attorney didn't really mount much of a defense. I kind of touched on some of it before, and I touch on it more in the episode. But, the attorney also encouraged him to not testify. And, just being 17 years old, he decided to listen to his attorney. Jeff spent 16 years in prison, and one of the most interesting things that I thought when talking to him was about his experience in prison and just kind of how he coped at 17 years old and, going into his adulthood, being in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And I thought it was really interesting, some of the things that he used to think about and the tools that he would use to sort of pretend that he wasn't really in prison. He would pretend that, instead of the warden, it was actually the superintendent of, this school that he was in. And so he did all these sorts of things that you don't really get too much insight into, or at least I never have. So I thought that was really fascinating. After 16 years in prison, Jeff was finally exonerated. And not only was he exonerated, but he was found to be actually innocent, where basically everybody in the case agrees that he is not the one who committed the crime. And in fact, the DNA and that hair that I told you about earlier came back to somebody else who was serving time in prison for a murder that happened a few years after this murder. And that inmate ended up confessing to this murder, leaving Jeff completely exonerated and in the clear. But, starting life after Jeff was released from prison is something that was not easy for him. And he talks a lot about that in the episode as well. But eventually, it's been 14 years since he was released. And, he's getting his life back. And not only is he getting his life back, but he's doing things and going out there to try and make sure that this sort of thing does not happen again. He goes around and he speaks to police cadets and judges and attorneys and talks to them about what to look for with false confessions and, how to try and ensure that this sort of thing that happened to him doesn't happen again. He also started the Jeff Deskovic Foundation, where he's working with current inmates who he believes are innocent and trying to exonerate them as well. So Jeff is an extremely inspiring person who's taking something really awful that happened to him and trying to make sure that it doesn't happen again, which I just think is extremely admirable. Jeff's not the first wrongful conviction case that I've covered on Court Junkie, as many of you may know. Christine Bunch is another exoneree that I talked to, and her story is absolutely, for lack of a better word, fascinating. It's horrible, but she is somebody else who's trying to use what happened to her to change the system. It doesn't matter how many exonerees and people that I talk to about this sort of thing, it still shocks me every single time, just that our system works this way. And it's still very, very, very upsetting. If you're interested in this kind of thing, feel free to check out the episode on Jeff Deskovic, on Christine Bunch. There are so many other great podcasts out there as well that focus on wrongful convictions and, the way in which our justice system works. I'd love for you to check those out as well. And definitely check out Jeff's foundation. And, he's a really open, honest, great guy. So, he even told me that if anybody wanted to reach out to him, he'd be happy to talk to them as well. So definitely do that. I'll put his contact info in the show notes as well. And thanks for watching this video. Please follow me on my other social media channels, and I will also be starting a sort of casual YouTube show with one of my friends coming shortly on this channel, and we're going to, kind of sit around and discuss different cases that are interesting to us, and I hope you like it. So be on the lookout for that, and make sure to subscribe. That was my daughter in the background. Thanks again for watching. Until next time.